when we talk about some of the technologies we develop, one of the key ones is our base port, and I'm actually going to turn it over to Charles now, and he's going to get more into this.
All right. Okay, so Nate mentioned the neutral frequency response, and that's a key part of that. But for the people that we design these speakers for, it's more than just having, it's part of that is having neutral monitor. The other part is not having distractions. Because keep in mind, our primary customer is using these products as a tool to make decisions with, and they need to be able to make good decisions, and they need to not be distracted. So the port tube that we have on the front of the loudspeaker is shaped a little, it's an interesting shape to give it the maximum amount of surface area, but there's a little bit more under the hood, namely the fact that it was designed using computational fluid dynamics. Basically, it's finite element analysis to predict the airflow so that we can optimize the design for low noise. And that means, especially in a front firing port tube, because it's pointed right at you, any kind of turbulence or noise you're going to hear. So we need to make sure the port is going to be, the only sounds coming out of the port tube is the base frequency that it's supposed to be producing. And so that's what we've done. Yeah, a little bit of a fun story about this one. We are using a computational fluid dynamic programs that happens to be command line, and the design of experiments was something over 100 iterations of this experiment to optimize the design fully. So it took a little bit of time, but I think the results are really worth it as far as having a quiet design. Part of the other things we do, and by the way, these are things that don't really add anything. This is value added to the speaker at no extra expense. You're going to create a port tube no matter what you do. You ought to get the shape right so that it doesn't make noise. The speaker on the left is our Lone Pine, and you'll notice the waveguide that's on the front of that. The waveguide doesn't cost any extra money, but it allows us to control the directivity of the tweeter such that it matches the woofer at the crossover frequency, which is really, really important. When we're talking about neutral sound, a lot of people say flat or, flat or neutral. But if you don't match the directivity of the tweeter to the woofer at the crossover point, what happens is the woofer, as it gets higher up in frequency and the wavelength gets to be close to the diaphragm size, the radiation pattern begins to pull in and starts to act like a flashlight. And at the crossover frequency, the tweeter turns on, and if you don't have a waveguide, well, the tweeter directivity is wide open. So you could make it flat on axis, but you can't make it neutral because the on-axis and off-axis sound doesn't match. The waveguide allows us to match that directivity such that you get the same timbre whether you're on axis or anywhere else in the room, right? And of course, the speaker on the right, I'm going to go into a little bit of detail of how we're controlling directivity in that, but it's the same story of getting the directivity right. But these are the things that we're working on. And again, we use predictive analysis to optimize the shape of everything. I'll get into that a little bit more as we move forward. Our amplifiers also have, you're going to pay for an amplifier no matter what you do. And it really doesn't cost that much more to get an amplifier with DSP on board. And DSP allows us to do a lot of things, one of which is to get a more neutral sound. But not only that, now we can get, again, adding just a little bit more and adding a dip switch on the back, we can get boundary EQs and real boundary EQs that allow you to put the speaker on a stand, on a console, on a table, or on different mounting configurations, and get the best sound in any one of those boundaries. This is all just part of good system design. These things really ought not to be, how do I say that? They ought to always be done. Good system design really doesn't cost that much other than the design time of doing it. And that's why we spend our time, because this is really where we add value. So Nate mentioned that Independence is one up from Lone Pine, and these are the products that we have: the Ion 5, which is a 5-inch three-way monitor, and the Ion 8, which has an 8-inch woofer. And so how do we get here? Well, yeah, after our Lone Pine and moving into what's next, because of the power requirement on the LP8, it actually has to have 2 amplifier chips. And it occurred to us that we had the amplifier channels that was necessary for a 3-way. The only thing we had to do is add mid-range. So that's what we did. And we did a little bit more than that. We figured that by making the mid-range a coaxial or coincident, not only could we save baffle space, but we could also, we could actually do it in a more cost-effective way and get acoustic benefits at the same time. And this is really where this value for this extraordinary value is coming from. So we talk about coaxial or coincident, and it's like all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares. Well, all coincident, I shouldn't say that. This transducer is not only coaxial, but it's also coincident. I should say all coincident speakers are coaxial, but not all coaxials are coincident. Not only do the drivers share the same axis, but you'll notice that the tweeter is right at the base of the mid-range cone. And that means that they're time aligned. And that's important. Not only is there no interference between the 2 transducers across their operating range, and including the crossover point, they share the same acoustic center. And this allows you to do things. Not only is the imaging really amazing, but now you can put these speakers on their side if you're mixing video and your sight lines require the loudspeakers on the side. People always used to ask us, can I put the Lone Pine speakers on the side? And the answer really is you can, but it's not optimal, because those 2 transducers, just the physics of a non-coincident 2-way, those 2 transducers at their crossover points are going to have cancellations off axis. And if you put them on their side, then those cancellations might be pointing at your first reflections, your side reflections, and that can influence the perceived timbre. On the independent speakers, you don't have that issue because those transducers don't interfere with one another. And of course, that's one benefit. The other benefit is really good temporal or time resolution.
I was actually showing Chana these speakers, and we were standing, because I have a standing desk, and so the speakers were below us here, and typically that's really kind of the worst place for most 2-ways, above the speaker, and it wasn't an issue. No, it's
not. It's a point source, which is great. And being able to do this at this price point is just been super fun. So not only are they coincident, but they're also, the directivities match the crossover. And that's because the cone shape forms the waveguide. Mm-hmm. Right. And when we spend a lot of time optimizing the cone geometry for, removal breakup modes and the directivity of those, of the 2 transducers together. And the benefits of that is uniform sound across a broad listening area. Like you said, you can be above them, you can be below them, you can be anywhere across your console. I'm speaking with regards to a mixer or mastering engineer. You can be anywhere across your workstation and have confidence in what your mix is. Of course, and for home listening, that translates to you can be anywhere in a wide listening area and have the sound be the same. Not only that, as I mentioned earlier, the imaging is just amazing on these. Okay, so one of the things that can happen, but you got to be careful of, one of the things that can happen is if if the cone excursion of that whatever's surrounding that tweeter, if the cone excursion is too great, what will happen is it's like moving the waveguide while the tweeter's moving.
Right.
And it's going to modulate that sound. It's called intermodulation distortion. It's not good. It sounds like a remote. It sounds like the voice is trembling or gurgling, or it's not good. So what we did is we're using that outer cone as a mid-range only. We've got it crossed over at 300 hertz so that the cone excursion is limited to 1 millimeter, and that puts it below your threshold of perception. What happens at very low levels, it's not moving anywhere near a millimeter, you can't hear it. And even at the top levels of output of the loudspeaker, that cone excursion is less than 1 millimeter, and that puts it below your ability to perceive it. And the benefit is no perceivable intermodulation distortion. So the mid-range, and by the way, to back up a little bit, we custom design all of our transducers. We spend the time to dig into the details of how everything goes together. You're going to spend money on magnets and steel building a transducer no matter what you do. So if you spend the time to make sure that the geometry is fully optimized, you're getting the maximum amount of value for the money that's being spent. We kind of look at ourselves as being stewards of our customers' investment in their audio. And so we want to get the maximum amount of value we can for everything we do. All of our transducer motor structures are fully optimized, and this one is actually pretty special. Not only does it have the optimized geometry, and actually, let me talk a little bit more about the optimized geometry. When you talk about a transducer is not a linear device. In other words, you have the motor strength or the motor field we call BL, which is the magnetic strength times the coil that's actually in the gap. But we have it has a small signal number, but once that cone starts to move, that number decreases. And so it's got a shape of a curve. And if you're designing the motor correctly, you're designing it for the most stable amount of motor strength over the given excursion. We've got mechanical, the spring constant, the compliance of the transducer is a function of frequency. But also, in addition to compliance and force, you have inductance. Basically, the voice coil is a coil of wire, and it's wrapped around the pole piece, which is like a core of an inductor. And as it moves in and out, the inductance is changing. So there's a couple of circled elements here, and these are sleeves and 2 rings of aluminum. Very little expense in adding these, but what they do is 2 things. Is to linearize the inductance of that voice coil. And also, another way to look at a voice coil is like an electromagnet. When you put current through that voice coil, it creates a magnetic field of its own. So what that magnetic field does is it modulates the field of the motor and causes distortion. By adding these rings, what you're doing is you're providing an electrical short. And what happens is it induces the magnetic field, but the magnetic field is repelled or resisted, not resisted, the resisted is the wrong word. It is counteracted by the field created in these aluminum rings. And what that does is it minimizes your flux modulation. So you have inductance nonlinearity, and you get flux modulation. And these rings for 20 or 30 cents bring down those elements that cause distortion. The distortion is reduced by about 6 dB. Big benefit, minimal expense. Other elements I'll push or I'll point out is the way the tweeter is situated in the cone for that coincident design.
By the way, just to let you know, I'm loving all of this info.
Yeah,
in case you're wondering.
I'm super geeking out. So
I love
I'll
it.
get
I
into
love it.
details, and if I get into too much details, please correct me. But
No, don't stop.
I think-
I don't think our next seminars for a while. So
Okay.
you keep going.
Okay, good.
Somebody in the chat said that whiteboard's underutilized. So
Okay.
I love this. This is like a lesson.
Okay, I'm going to take that as a hint, and I'm going to, if it's okay, kind of talk a little bit more about nonlinear parameters. So now, I'm going to have to watch where I'm at. Tell me when I get to the edge of the screen. Am I at the edge of the screen now?
Can you see?
yeah, you're good.
Yeah, we can see you.
So let's call this line x equals 0, right? So I mentioned that BL and whatever the other axis is, BL is not a straight line. In a perfect transducer, in a perfect world, BL would be this straight line. It would be perfectly linear, right? But it's not. And so many transducers will have a BL curve that looks like a parabola. And it's one strength in the middle, but as soon as you get off that middle, it drops off. And this part is actually more important on low frequency devices, especially ones that go up to the mid-range, like on two-way monitors. It's also important on the mid-range, but when you're talking about high excursion, it becomes very important. So if you design the system correctly and you get the geometry optimized, what you're able to do is to get it to be more linear in the operating range of the transducer. And so in this region here, before it drops off to whatever the prescribed Xmax is, you get greater linearity. It's one of the things that we do. With regards to, again, let's talk about, well, compliance is very much the same as BL. When we do that correctly, we're linearizing the center. Inductance, and this is x equals 0. Inductance obviously optimally is a straight line, but what really happens is that this is woofer in and this is out. When the voice coil is in, the inductance is high, and then when it's out, it's low. I'm oversimplifying this. By adding the shorting rings, we can get it closer to this line. And then that, in addition to the reduction of flux modulation, lowers the distortion of the transducer. There's a company named Klippel that manufactures test equipment to measure nonlinear parameters, and they really have some good write-ups on nonlinear distortion that I would invite anybody to take a look at. And if they really wanted to dig into the details, it's all right there. I don't know their exact web address, but I'm sure we can find it and put it up if people want to dig into that. So moving on.